For the CSAC uh, um, honors cohort. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the deputy director here at CSAC, also one of the honors program co-instructors with Dr. Cameron Tracy. It's a pleasure to introduce Chase Small, who was advised on this thesis by Ken Schultz and Renee DeResta, framing the front lines, great power narratives on Facebook in India about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Chase, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Trinkunas. I want to start today with a puzzle, and that's the case of E.R. Yamini. Yamini has amassed a following on Instagram. She's from India, and she posts videos of herself singing Bollywood songs. These videos are seen by her hundreds of thousands of followers, and if you scroll through them, you'll notice she never talks about politics. So it was strange during the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in February of 2022 that when she steadily started stating strong opinions on the current events. She tweeted hashtag I stand with Putin and hashtag I stand with Russia next to a video of two men hugging that were labeled as Indian Prime Minister Modi and Russian President Putin. Understanding India's stance on the Russian invasion is important here because India is neutral and maintains official neutrality, has not blamed Russia for the war, and it continues to trade with Russia. So understanding the voices of people in India can help us better understand India's foreign policy. But what's interesting about Yamini and this case is that these actually didn't belong to her. These were tweets that were part of a network of coordinated, inauthentic tweets that used real people's images to build a false sense of popular support for the invasion. So these weren't actually her tweets. So there is a battle taking place on social media for people's attitudes on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's happening in India. And when I read this back in the fall, I was really struck because, first of all, I've spent a couple of years myself living in India and speak Hindi, and I really see the importance of India as a strategic country for the future. Second, I've spent a lot of my time at Stanford studying disinformation. And so bringing those two things together, I saw that this was a really important opportunity to better understand the influences in India. And it's really important that we understand this because India plays a crucial role in this conflict because it is well positioned to play a role in the resolution of the war. First, India itself is an emerging power. It recently became the most populous country, recently passing China last month. Has the third largest GDP. It's one of 9 nuclear states. And previously, its foreign policy was very defensive. During the Cold War, it was unaligned and really worked to make sure that politics between the US and Soviet Union didn't interfere with its domestic politics. But in the past few years, Prime Minister Modi has expressed desires for India to become more active in the global stage. But besides its rising power, India also plays an important role because it is unaligned. India during the Cold War was officially neutral, but it built up economic and military ties with the Soviet Union. And even today, 85% of India's military equipment comes from Russia. At the same time, since 2007, India and US relations have been growing rapidly. In 2007, we signed a breakthrough non-proliferation agreement. And since then, we're now part of a strategic security dialogue, the Quad, along with Japan and Australia. So we also have budding relations with India. So this means that India is both poised to play a role in the negotiations between both sides of this conflict, and also India is not aligned with either bloc here. This means that it could be shifted either direction, and social media could play a role in that because it's a democracy theoretically beholden to the views of its population, and influence is happening online. I'll note also that India has the largest population of Facebook users in the world, so it is plugged in. So I want to understand how, I want to take a moment and talk about my questions here. I want to understand how actors from the United States, Russia, and China used Facebook during the invasion to influence audiences in India. Today in my presentation, I'm going to focus on understanding the differences in narratives coming from the US, Russia, and China on Facebook. And these are going to be coming from both state and non-state actors on Facebook. So when I talk about actors, I'm talking about pages from Facebook. And I look primarily at pages where the majority of followers are in India, but the pages themselves are from the US, Russia, and China. And then I'm going to look at pages from India to see how they align with those narratives from those different countries, to see if it aligns more with one country or another. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit of background on propaganda and how states use influence on social media. I'm going to talk a little bit about my querying methodology, how I was able to access 250,000 Facebook posts about this. And then I'm going to talk through the narratives that I identified by state and show how different states use different narratives to discuss the invasion. And finally, I'm really excited to reveal India's alignment, so stay tuned. So first, I want to talk about propaganda. And to save all of our sanity today, I'm not going to get into the definitional debate that ravages this field, but I'm just going to use propaganda as like a politically neutral term here. It's the idea of using information to influence an audience to change their behavior. There are many ways to do this, including through inauthentic posts like we saw in that beginning of the presentation. But there are two other ways that I want to focus on today, and those are agenda setting and framing. So agenda setting is talking about the what, is choosing topics to make topics more salient to a target audience. It's not necessarily nefarious. All publishing outlets do it. In fact, I'm doing this right now by choosing what parts of my thesis I'm presenting to you. So just another reason to be skeptical of everyone and everything. The second is framing. That's what aspects of a topic you choose to focus on, the how. And this is important because you can take a topic and talk about it in two completely different ways to promote your values that align with a state or any actor. And those together create a narrative. A narrative is this temporal causal explanation of events that ties together a story to influence an audience. So let's take a quick example here to maybe talk a little bit what I'm talking about. So imagine you're reading an article early on in the invasion, and the article focuses on NATO. A lot of articles at the time were talking about NATO and talking about NATO's response or NATO's role in the invasion. This article is talking about NATO. It's chosen as an agenda setting to talk about NATO. And then it frames it as talking about it focusing on its expansion and how its expansion eastward has threatened Russian security. Together, these aspects create this narrative that NATO caused the war, and that NATO expansion caused the war. And for those of you that have been following the war, the invasion since the beginning, you know that this has been a Kremlin narrative from the start to justify their actions in Ukraine. So I want to take a step back from that theory for a second and talk about like what we actually know that states have done to promote their values and interests abroad on social media. Russia, China, and the US have all promoted their values abroad on social media, and they do it through a number of ways. Russia has been doing this in tandem with their conventional efforts in Ukraine since 2014. They have Russian state media that's under the editorial control of their government. And when they invaded in 2014, they flooded Facebook and other social media sites with posts to divert attention from the little green men annexing Crimea. China has recently really upped its investment in state media globally. These days, they spend $7 to $10 billion a year to promote their image on social media and through state media globally. A lot of research has focused on this in Latin America and Africa, but there's really a paucity of research understanding their role in South Asia. And finally, the US does this too. The US, since the 1940s, has had Voice of America, which was founded to combat or to counter Nazi propaganda, and still operates today with a budget of over $200 million. While the reporters for Voice of America supposedly have editorial independence, researchers have noted that Voice of America rarely publishes articles that go against US interests. But one other thing I want to note about the US is maybe one of its biggest influences isn't necessarily these publishing sites themselves, but these social media platforms. That Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies operating in the West act to further Western interests. So when Russia invaded Ukraine at the request of EU sanctions, Meta actually throttled social media sites or Russian state media pages so that they had a much lower reach on social media. And we're not totally sure what that impact was around the world, but certainly was the case in the US and EU. So that gives you a sense of maybe what we could expect to see in the lead up to the invasion. And now I want to talk about how I identified what actually happened in the 70 days before to the 70 days after the invasion on Facebook, primarily in India. So to get my data set, I use CrowdTangle, which is a Meta-owned platform. There's so many parameters you can play around with, and I'm happy to talk more about exactly what my queries looked like. But just for the sake of this, I want to focus on the fact that I was downloading posts from 70 days before to 70 days after the invasion from pages where most of the followers were in India. So this isn't every post that people in India saw, but the posts in my data set were primarily seen by people in India, not other countries. I also had access to information about where those posts were coming from. So I divided those posts up by their country of origin, focusing on posts from the US, Russia, and China. And you can see over here, here's a chart of the breakdown of the over 318,000 posts that I downloaded. And you'll notice that the vast majority of them are actually from India itself. So I think this is a first important finding, is that despite the presence of posts coming from the US, China, or Russia, domestic conversations dominate in this data set. And so that's really important as we start to think about what actually the influences are in India. So once I collected all of these, I went through a sample of posts from each state, and I manually looked at the content. So I looked through over 1,200 posts and looked at the content to identify that agenda setting and that framing, the what and the how they were talking about issues, to create a code book of narratives for each state. And I manually labeled posts from each state with that narratives code book. And what I found is that narratives hold on one second. I found that most frequent narratives from each state align with the position of that state on the war. Narratives were used to describe what caused the invasion, what the costs were, and how other states should respond. So here's a couple examples to show you what I mean. Pages from the US often talked about how Russian military aggression was fueling conflict and tensions and ultimately responsible for the Russian invasion, or for the war in Ukraine. In contrast, pages from China talked a lot about NATO expansion, or the fact that the US had bioweapons labs in Ukraine, and that's why Russia was there. US pages talked a lot about the humanitarian costs and the costs for civilians in Ukraine, whereas Russia talked about the huge costs that Western sanctions on Russia were having for the global economy. The US pages talked a lot about how the US should be supplying weapons to Ukraine, whereas Chinese pages were talking a lot about how China is a strong, neutral world power and just wants to promote peace, unlike the US, which is escalating the conflict by providing weapons. What's fascinating about this, the fact that I was able to identify these sorts of narratives, and I'll note that these are 6 of the 28 most frequent narratives that I use for the rest of this project, is that these narratives align with the state, despite the majority of actors who I was looking at being non-state actors. So I'm leaving out a big part of my thesis that looks into who the pages actually are that are propagating these narratives. But just know the big idea from that is that China was the only state that had a huge representation of China state media in my data set. So that means that, as we saw in the background, those pages that were targeting India in Hindi, trying to influence narratives about world events, really. Whereas the pages coming from the US and Russia were primarily non-state actors. These were things like celebrities and businesses and NGOs and independent newspapers. And so despite them being unaligned with the government, or not under the editorial control of the government, they still promoted narratives that aligned with their governments. And I think that's really interesting as we think through the impact of influence on social media, is that it's not necessarily just driven by state actors, by governments. And this is really cool. This is my first Hans Rosling moment right here. We can see, I basically mapped out the similarities and differences in the language of those narratives by state. So what this is showing here is basically the distance between two narratives represents the difference or similarity in the specific language and phrasing that's important to that narrative. So narratives that are right on top of each other use the exact same phrases and words, whereas narratives that are further away use different phrases, or basically frame the narratives in different light. I've highlighted the country that each narrative is from, or I've highlighted each narrative in a color corresponding to the country that it's from. So it's not important to see each individual narrative, but look at circle A here, and you'll notice that there's an overlap between narratives from China and Russia. These are from state and non-state actors from China and Russia. And this is fascinating because China touts its neutrality in the war, but you'll notice that it's framing the war in many similar ways as Russia is in terms of the language that it's using. In contrast, you look at circles B and C, the US and Russia use very different narratives. or use different framings. And that makes a lot of sense because they're on different sides of the conflict. So it's really cool to be able to visualize this. All right. And one final thing I'll note about this is what we've been talking about here are narratives from states that have primarily reached audiences in India. But now I want to turn to narratives from actors themselves in India. And I want to look at posts that originated in India to see how they align with posts from other countries. And I don't want to get too much into the technical details here. I'm happy to talk more about the machine learning tool techniques that I learned throughout this year in the Q&A. But just know for now that how I did this is I used a topic classifier. And a topic classifier is a machine learning technique that takes in labeled data, i.e. all that work that I just did, where I associated posts with specific narratives. It takes that in, it finds relationships between the content of those posts and the narratives themselves, and it builds these rules so that when it sees new narratives or new posts without a label, it can predict a label for it. If that makes sense. So it's a classifier. And I was pretty proud of my classifier. It agreed with me 80% of the time on a test set. So I think that's pretty good for the work we're doing here. It's definitely going to help us with the next segment here. And after I built this classifier, I ran every post from India through it, all 295,000 posts through it, to get a prediction of each post's most closest narrative. And that gives us a sense of, are these posts more like posts coming from the US or Russia or China? And the answer was very clear. This blue line, so what we're looking at here is the percent of posts from India and their alignment with narratives from each state. So the blue line are posts from India that most align with narratives from the US. Black line is China, the red line is Russia. So these are all Indian posts, but they align most with these narratives. And again, these are narratives coming from both state and non-state actors. These are just the most frequent narratives from each state's data set. And you'll see that in the lead up to the invasion, posts more closely align with those from the US. In fact, on the date of the invasion, 80% of the posts coming from Indian pages aligned with narratives from the US. And yeah, that's really cool. And we can break that down. So we can look at specific narratives themselves and see that really there are two narratives driving this trend. The first is this blue line here, which has to do with US's narrative around how this is Russia's military aggression's fault. That Russian military buildup and aggression is what is driving this conflict here. And we see in the lead up to the invasion, 50% of the posts in this data set from India align with this narrative. Narratives about, offering counterexamples that like this was a result of NATO or bioweapons or other possible, or that Ukrainians are Nazis, other possible explanations had much lower percentage alignment. So low, in fact, that I didn't include them on this graph because they just crowded up the bottom and they're now relegated to this gray other line. But so that's really fascinating to me. The second most important narrative that came up in India had to do with India, the fact that India had the largest population of study abroad or foreign students in Ukraine. Ukraine had 70,000 international students at the date of the invasion, and 20,000 of those were Indian nationals. So this was a pressing national priority after the invasion. And we can see that right after the invasion, the majority of posts from India aligned with this discussion of the importance of bringing these students home. And here's an example of a post that was classified as Indian student evacuation. This was a big political win for Modi. So I among the Hindi news pages that I looked at, these made up a majority of the page, or a lot of the top pages I looked at from India. A lot of them are BJP and Modi aligned right-wing pages. They touted this as a big win for Modi. So the translation of this screenshot of this video is basically like, today, Pakistan wishes they had Modi. And this caption says that Operation Ganga, the name of this evacuation operation, shows to the world that there's no world leader like Modi. So this was a big political win and a big domestic interest. Now, this is labeled as a US narrative because actors in the US discussed this, whereas actors in the samples I took from Russia and China did not. And this gets at an important nuance to these findings. These graphs do not show us anything about causation. Sure, we can say, I feel confident saying that whatever role Chinese state media played on Facebook in India during this period, it certainly wasn't enough to impact that the majority of pages from India aligned with US narratives. Still, the fact that US actors talked about Indian students shows that there's some alignment in how these countries were talking online. And one possible explanation I can think of is that some of the top pages from the US were Indian American influencers, Indian American celebrities like Padma Lakshmi, who's an Indian American writer. And these connections to friends and family in both countries likely facilitated some understanding of important issues across borders. And I think further research could really build off of the work I've done here to better understand these causal mechanisms with a focus on looking at diaspora communities. So what does this all mean? And I want to leave you with basically the three main takeaways that I'm leaving this year with. The first is that India is positioned to play an important role in the ending of the Russian invasion of Ukraine because it is powerful, but it's also not aligned. And personally, I think India is going to play a pivotal role in international relations in our lifetime generally. So understanding their domestic interests through research like this and other forms of research can better help understand drivers of Indian foreign policy. Second, states have and will continue to influence global audiences by spreading narratives on social media that further their interests. China has invested in state media targeting India and Hindi, and we've seen that private actors from Russia and the US also propagated narratives that align with their state, despite not being tied with the government. And finally, we saw that despite India's neutrality in this invasion, and despite efforts from China to influence Facebook in India, posts from India align mostly with narratives discussed from pages from the US. To me, this suggests that many Facebook users in India likely saw more posts discussing US-aligned framings of the war than Russian or Chinese ones. We were also able to show that narratives from China align with those from Russia, reflecting their emerging bloc. And so I end here today thinking that to understand the future of India and international relations generally, we can look at social media to understand domestic interests, foreign influences, and the framing of the front line. And before we go, I just want to share actually my biggest finding from all this work, which is that none of this work happens in a vacuum. And I want to take this last moment to give a huge thanks to my advisor, Dr. Ken Schultz and Renee DiResta, who were very patient and gave me a lot of great feedback, for Dr. Trinkunas and Dr. Tracy for their effort, to my friend Joel Johnson, who was the brain behind a lot of the brainstorming of this methodology. Ryan helped me with this presentation, and to all of you for being here today. Thanks for letting me share this with you. Appreciate it.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. By tradition, the faculty advisors ask the first question. So over to Dr. Schultz. If you're online, just type in your question in the Q&A function of Zoom.
Right. Chase, that was great. Wonderful presentation and a great thesis. So I actually have two questions, and both of them kind of go beyond what you did, and so it's the usual unfair question about what you would do next. So the first question has to do with that you started your talk with an example about inauthentic social media post on Twitter. My sense is a lot of what you're doing here with the Facebook is authentic, or at least certainly traceable to these countries of origin on Facebook. I'm just wondering, is what else is there of this social media environment that we should be studying next, and what else do you think is going on? And then the second question I have is about what you think about how this scales up to actual policy, or I mean, and that's probably that's really unfair, but even like if you went to India and you just asked people about their beliefs about these different narratives, do you think that what you're seeing in the virtual world is mirrored in the real world?
Yeah, both fantastic questions. And I'll start with the first one by talking a little bit about Renee DiResta's work. That's been a motivator for a lot of the work I've done here at Stanford. And that's looking at the idea of full spectrum propaganda, understanding that actors use both covert and overt means in tandem. And so what I was looking at here was primarily overt influence means, whereas what we started the presentation with was a covert operation, in that it was, as you were saying, not traceable. But what the idea of full spectrum propaganda suggests is that there is a tandem effort going on. And so my goal in looking at this was thinking about, okay, first of all, studying overt is much easier than studying covert. And so we can better understand what's happening on the overt, that is like looking at the tip of the iceberg for what's happening in the covert space. And I think that's particularly important in India, where there hasn't been much work even in understanding the overt influences there. So that's how I'd respond to the first one. And so obviously there should be more work on the covert. It gets tricky to do so. And there has been some great work out of SIO on that. The second having to do with the policy implications. I think the interesting thing about working in this space is that when you ask about policy implications, the first set of policy implications I think of are not government policy, but platform policies, how social media themselves thinks about how to govern these spaces online. And I think this is fascinating because one, for me, I'll go out on a limb and say, we are concerned a lot about the presence of state media on platforms, but just because it's there doesn't mean it's necessarily having a dangerous impact per se. And I think platform efforts to label is super important, but maybe I found that they are not always perfect in how they label. So for example, things like Voice of America isn't labeled as a state controlled media outlet, even though it gets its funding from the US. A lot of the Chinese pages that I looked at were of reporters who work for Chinese state outlets, but were not labeled themselves as a Chinese state controlled media outlet. So I think that's super important. And to your final point, I do think that understanding how this translates on the ground is super important. And I would love to make that a next step in my journey by heading back there. So thank you.
Great. If you want to get on the Q&A queue, just sort of raise your hand and we'll pass the microphone to you so the online audience can hear you. See Rose Gottemiller in the back.
Hi, Chase. Really cool research. I enjoyed hearing your report. But I did have a question. You have there your conclusion about private actors from the US and Russia did the same. Now, when I think about private actors in the US and private actors in Russia, they are two quite different kinds of beasts. So, how did you come to make them equivalent in your conclusions?
Great question. And as I noted, so in my actual thesis, I spent a lot more time describing the who of these pages. I'll note that the pages from Russia were primarily commercial pages. So a lot of them were from various software companies. A big top page from Russia was the Sputnik vaccine manufacturer. And so these were primarily commercial pages, which was very similar to the US had a lot of commercial pages. But the US also had a lot more pages that were news sites and individual influencers and celebrities. So they really aren't an equivalent. And I think to your point, breaking that down is really important. But I do think it's fascinating that private companies from Russia are discussing similar narratives to those that align with the Russian government.
Ethan Lee.
Thank you, Chase. It's been such a pleasure watching this project evolve and you see the final results. I'm curious to speculate a little bit. Why do you think that China's narratives aren't really or these Chinese narratives aren't really hitting home as much? Like, I guess, do you when we think about soft power and like co-option, do you see that as like kind of being? Is it because it's hosted on Facebook, or like I guess what's been some of your thinking around why these narratives aren't landing?
Always asking the tough questions. I appreciate you. Certainly hard to guess about any of the causal mechanisms. I will say that in the research looking at the pages from China, their main focus really at the end of the day, the most of the content they posted was focused on promoting India-Chinese relations. So one of the top pages in the data set by total interactions was this woman, Neelam, who is this Chinese woman who speaks in Hindi, who celebrates Indian holidays, but also talks a lot about her time in China to paint a positive picture of China. And so I think maybe a big aspect of it is that the aim of these Chinese state media pages is primarily to promote China and promote the image of the CCP. So that might give some explanation to why it's less effective around other narratives for different current events.
All right. One very short answer.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we talk a lot about the power that generative AI will have in changing the information space on the content creation side, but this is a really cool kind of exposition of how analysis of like large scale amounts of social media information can give us insights on the dynamics happening in specific countries. How do you think that should shape US strategy in the information space moving forward?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. We joke about ChatGPT writing our thesis, and mine literally did. So thank you, OpenAI. Um, I mean, I think it gives us these same tools that social media companies have had for years to understand what's happening on their platforms. And I think we're really on the precipice of better research for understanding what's happening on these platforms, for connecting it to the real world. And I think that'll continue to be driven in the academic space, where we deal with less problems of government overreach. But it certainly is super important as we better understand these effects. So,
Great.
Thank you.
Now on to our next presentation. We'll give it a minute for the room to turn over. Jordan. I'm so used to calling you. They're not. Hopefully they're on Zoom. They'll be in a couple of minutes.
I just saw your email. Yeah, I'll definitely take care of it.
Yeah, but keep it on the down low.
Yeah, I will.
Especially because they're all in here. All right.
We're on.
Let's get started with the next presentation. You can take your seats, please. It's a pleasure to introduce CSAC Honors Program member Jordan Tirico, who will be speaking on his thesis on changing strategies of Mexican drug trafficking organizations in the context of synthetic opioids. Over to you, Jordan.
Yeah, hi everyone. Again, thanks for coming. Thank you, Dr. Trinkunis. Thank you to my thesis advisor, Robert McCune. And yeah, excited to share what I've done over this year. If I know how to go next on the slides. Yeah, that works just as well. Okay, great. So a quick roadmap. I'm going to be breezing through the background here because I think there's interesting stuff to get to beyond. I'm going to quickly go through my logic and methods section and then go into the testing, the results of that testing, a quick discussion of that, and then a quick conclusion at the end. So before I dig into this thesis, I want to motivate whatever I'm talking about today with these two graphs. So here on the left, we have the number of monthly murders in Mexico from 2005 to 2022. And here on the right, we have the number of drug-involved overdose deaths in the United States from around 2000 to 2021. So underlying my thesis is the argument that these two graphs are not two separate phenomena in themselves, but two consequences of the same events in a shared history. So importantly, also to note before we dig into this presentation, both these graphs in their numeric numbers and their upward trending graphs, they hide behind them like years of pain and years of suffering that by nature of this presentation and by nature of my observer position during this presentation is sterilized in the next 20 or so slides. But the real lives at stake and the real urgency that this issue poses must not be lost as we go through. So like I mentioned before, I'm going to breeze through this background A quick formation of DTOs in Mexico and war on drugs. Up until 1980, basically, this slide tries to cover some of it. The key takeaways from that time period is the increased enforcement led to Mexican drug smugglers to collectivize and formalize. And then it also meant that Mexicans' role as a middleman, due to their position geographically and also due to drug prohibition laws in the United States, became next to an inevitability. Now, the evolution from 1980 to around 2022, a lot has changed with how these groups organize. The main takeaways from the 40-year evolution is that the modern DTO is violent, savvy, and profit-driven, and they have high economic, social, and political capital, and they know how to wield it. So quickly glancing over to the United States side of this, the opioid epidemic, 3 waves, and the key takeaway are surrounding the last 2 waves, waves 2 and 3, so that the drugs responsible, heroin and synthetic opioids, for the last 2 waves are mostly supplied by Mexican drug trafficking organizations. Now, we're going to slow down a little bit here and try to dive into why fentanyl is so deadly. So, of course, everyone kind of knows and understands the potency at which these chemicals affect the human body, and that high toxicity and the small size and the simple production methods also are very relevant to DTOs. So, the high toxicity is useful to DTOs in the sense that they're an adulterant. Synthetics like fentanyl can be an adulterant to other drugs, raising profits by increasing the volume of the amount of drugs that they can sell. Now, the small size that is a corollary of the high toxicity of these drugs means that these DTOs, there's a smaller threat level for sneaking in these drugs over the border into the United States. And the third kind of property of these synthetics that are important to mention is the simple production method. Much like methamphetamine, synthetic opioids like fentanyl can be produced in clandestine laboratories, decentralized, which offers DTOs the ability to create a more robust production chain and have a very decentralized and kind of low low cost for production. Going next, I sought to test out the theory that synthetic opioids have mostly, in a lot of ways, replaced heroin. This has been kind of noted qualitatively, and I wanted to ask, can we make this empirical? Can we verify that the major criminal groups have also shifted their geographic focus in conjunction with this shift in drug type? And B, how can we measure this shift with an approximate variable? So going over the logics next. So the causal logic that kind of outlines my thesis idea is that synthetics, as for the reasons mentioned before, they return higher profits for DTOs. And thus, since they have higher profits for DTOs, they will prioritize the shipment of these synthetic opioids and other drugs in place of heroin specifically. Now, these resources that are necessary in order to produce these drugs are going to be shifted away from the heroin production areas and towards ports, why ports? Ports are an important node in the supply chain for synthetic opioids generally. And then this shift will be able to be tracked on data regarding cartel violence. So I quickly found out that collecting data on cartel violence is really no small feat. After about 4 months of skirmishing around online trying to find something to work with, I stumbled upon the ACLAD database. Now, this database is really important as it's a detailed, geolocated, and event database for the entire globe. And this has an open source nature, which means that it is taking daily updates from regional and local news sources and uploading it into one database itself. So for some countries, including Mexico, they count cartel violence as a component of political violence, which is kind of the goal of the ACLAD database. And cartel violence being interpreted as having political consequences in some countries like Mexico means that they are one of the 44 Latin American states, or one of the 10 out of 44 Latin American states that include criminal violence within political violence. Important to mention about this data set, it spans from 2018 to 2023, to the present day. And this start date, 2018, is important in that it really lines up well with the third wave of the opioid epidemic, namely synthetic opioids. So having that 5-year time period where in this 5 years, there's been an explosion in the trafficking of synthetic opioids makes this a really relevant kind of time frame for my data. So this data is downloadable in unstructured format, So from that, I had to self-curate the data in order to create kind of testable data sets. So each individual event, kind of a description of what the data looks like itself, each individual event comes with a bunch of variables associated with it, one of which being this actor variable. And under the actor variable, you have the perpetrator and the subject of the violent event that the ACLAD database is talking about for that significant one. Therefore, each of the actor variables, the variable sets, has associated with it has associated with it a list of all the possible actors or perpetrators of violence, and cartels and cartel members are what some of the unique entries within this list. So my job of curation was to go through all of the overall database, pick out the ones that had cartel violence associated with it, and then from there create two separate subsets. One for the first hypothesis, which focuses on the heroin production municipalities, and the second for the port municipalities that I'm going to test. So for hypothesis number one, it's pretty simple. Less cartel violence in heroin producing areas. Now, to test this, I had to first figure out exactly where these opium and heroin producing areas are in Mexico. This is a very difficult task unto itself. Thankfully, I was able to borrow a data set that tracks all of the municipalities that are most suitable ecologically for opium production. And from this, I used the fourth quartile results and then manually sifted through all of these individual municipalities and created this first data set. The second hypothesis tests the corollary of that first one, namely that as cartels draw back from heroin production municipalities, they will focus their efforts, whether it be violence, whether it be bodies, on port municipalities. Now, ports are key because they are the only identifiable node within the supply chain of synthetic opioids. Identifiable meaning once it gets into Mexico, it is decentralized, as I mentioned before. So ports being one of the main shipping kind of entryways for these precursors, which are mostly produced in Asia, specifically China. The 7 largest Pacific Coast ports, I chose to be the second set of municipalities to use to test this corollary hypothesis. So into the results and discussion. So here are my results. So hypothesis number one, oh no, these are not my results. Sorry about that. These are testing. Okay, so the testing that I went through first, these two hypotheses could be tested together with a relatively simple ordinary least squares regression. So I use what's called interaction terms to capture the relationship over time. What these interaction terms essentially are asking or saying is, what is the impact on violence, my dependent variable on the left, if I'm in a heroin producing or a port municipality over time. Now, looking again at my DV, my dependent variable, I looked at the proportion of cartel-related violent events within the larger subset of all violent events in a municipality. So I looked at proportion, not the count of events, which I'll get back to in a little bit. Now I get to go to my results. So my results for number one, it was validated, albeit slightly. So what's important to notice about those numbers over there is that first coefficient, that negative 0.0024. Now it looks like a small number because it is a small number, but we have to remember that this number also represents a proportion, so it's going to be a percentage, and also monthly. So it looks scary at first. I saw that, I was like, are you kidding me? But when you extrapolate it over the 5-year time period, you see that there's been almost a 15% decrease in the proportion of cartel violence within the heroin municipalities. Now, I got similar results for hypothesis 2, which is not what I was expecting. So as we see there, there's a very similar coefficient, minus 0.03, actually a stronger decrease monthly for the port municipalities. And this kind of extrapolates to around a 19% decrease in proportion of cartel violence within these port municipalities. So it validated the idea that less cartel violence is occurring in heroin producing areas, but it invalidated the idea that cartel violence is shifting towards port areas. So these results, especially result number 2, really kind of threw a wrench in my logic that kind of motivated this whole process. We noticed a statistically significant decrease in the proportion of cartel violence in both sets of municipalities, which is an important finding onto itself. But like I said before, it kind of skews what I had thought as the original train of logic here. Are we seeing DTOs retreat from both heroin producing and port areas? What's really going on here? I had to do some more research to figure it out. So this finding definitely originally puzzled me, but with further qualitative reporting, like as recently as this month, has filled in a lot of the blanks and understanding what's really going on here. So to do this, it's worth diving deeper into the supply chain for synthetic opioids. So the chain described here, from production in China and marketing in China transportation to brokers in Mexico, all the way to wholesale retailers in the United States, has an important distinction from the heroin production supply chain. So as we can see here, the brokers in Mexico are normally independent importers, whereas the large cross-border transport organizations like the Sinaloa cartel don't come into the fore until a little bit later on in the supply chain. So this means essentially, or I must say first, that this supply chain is a relatively novel supply chain. The switch from heroin to synthetics has been occurring in the past 7 or 8 years. And this is a very, very short time in which these large organizations like Sinaloa and CJNG, the largest and most violent criminal organizations, they have not had time to vertically integrate with the entire supply chain. So as that quote says, they do not get directly involved until these substances have been gathered in bulk in Mexico. Thus, it makes sense that the ports wouldn't be as important nodes to the largest DTOs, and this means they might not be found in the violence data. Now, I explored social network analysis for about 6 months of my thesis, and all I have for it is this slide. But in actuality, these network graphs are pretty instructive and can help explain the surprising result number 2. So here, this EgoNet depicts the 2 major cartels, Cartel de Sinaloa and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. And it depicts that they have a very kind of segmented bipolar alliance structure. So all these kind of lines pointing to new organizations represent an alliance between a group. And you can see there's 4 kind of brokerage position alliance group or brokerage position organizations. And what's really interesting about these brokerage position organizations is that they mostly specialize on fentanyl export and are mostly located in and around the regions of the ports. So given that cartel rivalry is correlated with violent outcomes, and since these smaller, less violent criminal organizations handle most of the import of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, which are the port transactions, then it makes sense that there would be a decrease in violence at ports as these specialized groups move in to cover the more specialized and now popular drug of import. And I think that quote kind of also sums it up well, is that these criminal groups are not fighting, the major groups are not fighting over these areas and these ports. Rather, they share suppliers because the profits are so high that it's not worth fighting and gaining unilateral control. So there's a bunch of compounding factors that could be involved in play here. Tracking DTOs empirically is very hard, specifically because every instance of cartel present, every iteration, every city that has its own history of cartel involvement and cartel struggle tells a different story. This, more than anything, I think drives home the importance of verifying and surrounding any empirical data with qualitative evidence and qualitative on-the-ground reporting, which of course I wasn't in the best position to do. But I try to use proportion of violent events rather than the simple event count in order to account for some of these compounding factors, like increased enforcement, population, and socioeconomic status. Any changes in those would be accounted for in the proportion, whereas it wouldn't be accounted for if I just focused on the counts. So now we get to conclusion time. So we'll close out with a list of conclusions, partially informed by the statistics and the work of the research that I did, but more so also informed by my perspective doing this whole project and learning, diving headfirst into the opioid epidemic and also drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Kind of my general takes on policy and what are some of the options out of what seems like a very difficult situation and a dual upward trends. So the first takeaway is about the data set. So ACLED's data set is certainly a positive step towards uncovering the strategies of DTOs, and it's a positive step that hasn't really been utilized by researchers in criminology that well and that often. So my thesis, the real kind of takeaway from the results of the thesis is that it demonstrates the validity of approximating cartel presence with rate of cartel violence, which verifies literature on criminal violence itself. Now, I couldn't get my hand. So another thing that I'd like to mention about the ACLED database is that I couldn't get my hands on basically any other data that would have been useful for this project. So I reached out countless times to Mexican authorities, to researchers. I had a hard time gathering seizure statistics, data on raids on clandestine laboratories or cartel violence generally. ACLED given that it's open source, fills a really valuable hole in this whole process. And this data set, like I mentioned before, it's relatively new. It was released in 2020, or the Mexican data was released for the ACLE database in 2020. And it's clear from my experience using it as a research into drug trafficking organizations that there are relevance beyond researchers studying simply violence or political violence, but also has impact and should be used by researchers studying organized crime as well. So my second takeaway here discusses policy relevance, essentially asking like, what are possible solutions? It seems like there's two upward trends that show no sign of abating anytime soon. How are any of us, to any researchers or policy people, trying to deal with this situation? So the way I kind of understand it as it is there are two siloed conceptions of one similar policy challenge. So the public health conception that's located up there really implicates demand side, what are called demand side solutions. So demand side solutions are solutions that focus on reducing or controlling the US demand of illicit substances. So these historically have not been the primary choice for trying to tackle the situation of drug overdose in the United States, yet, and have therefore failed to, in a lot of ways, stop the rise of the opioid epidemic. But renewed efforts in harm reduction and decriminalization are kind of steps in the right direction for these demand side solutions. So I think that they just need political will in order to become a more relevant component of the policy solution here. And now this kind of conception, this public health conception, is juxtaposed as well by the national security conception of this issue. These kind of directly imply supply side solutions, which focus on reducing or controlling the supply of illicit substances. Historically, these have also failed. And in the process of doing this whole thesis, trying to figure out where I lied in terms of what position I believed in and what I thought was the best way forward, demand or supply, was kind of a fraught experience for me, because the motivation for this thesis was from the demand aspect of it, was the opioid epidemic, right? And experiences seeing people that lose their lives too early to overdose, accidental overdose. That's a really demand side motivation. And from that perch, I saw the history of the war on drugs and the history of supply side solutions from the United States really mostly being a failure. But as I kind of dove deeper into this process and this research project, I ended up focusing, of course, on drug trafficking organizations. And this implies naturally that there are supply side issues. If you're investigating what the strategies of a DTO are, then behind that is the implication that if you knew what a DTO was doing better, you could do things to stop it. You could interdict some of their product that's moving north. You could try to weed them out from individual cities. You could remilitarize. There's a lot of different options. So the implication of where my focus was for this thesis ended up being different from my motivation. So my final kind of takeaway for what can go on in terms of finding a solution is, in classical political science fashion, bilateralism between and creating a collaborative counter-narcotics relationship between the United States and Mexico. So despite official reports from the Biden administration, there's still today little semblance of proactive collaboration, as indicated by that quote on the bottom right of the slide here. And bilateralism, in my opinion, it starts with a shared understanding of the problem. Understanding that it's not simply a supply side issue or a demand side issue that implicates one country at a time, but rather this is a problem that has two legs, and you must greet them standing on those two legs together. So despite coordinated press statements, the security officials and the AMLO administration in Mexico have recently been denying that there's large-scale fentanyl synthesis happening in country, which has been refuted by many third-party sources. Additionally, Mexico is not allowing joint raids with US counterparts. This reticence is completely understandable given the history of US drug policy in Mexico and the detrimental effects that it has had. But the reality is that this conflict is still being militarized just unilaterally. And finally, my one takeaway that I think that kind of comes back into my thesis is that Mexico, any direction forward, Mexico is unlikely to jump at security-focused bilateral missions. But one example of a social or economic proposition that would probably have more stick is this idea of Sembrando Vida. So Sembrando Vida is a program that compensates farmers who grow, Mexican program that compensates farmers who grow sustainable crops. And this is especially pertinent to my research, the results of my thesis. Say, for example, the heroin production areas are being exited in large mass by criminal organizations, drug trafficking organizations, then there's a huge opportunity here for US and Mexico collaboration on drug policy that doesn't directly implicate supply side solutions, but also can represent that this issue is not just one, but it's two separates. So there's an update to Adobe Flash that we don't need. And yes, that's it. Thank you guys. Do you have any questions for me?
All right. We have time for maybe 5-7 minutes worth of questions. Let's see, just if you raise your hands and get on the queue, okay. Let's go, oh, okay. Okay, why don't you start, Dean, and then we'll just go across here, and then Ethan, and then to you.
Really enjoyed your presentation. I learned a lot, and I actually used to direct a clinic at our county hospital in San Jose, and had a lot of drug users that would kind of keep me up to date. But it's been more than 10 years, so before fentanyl. So this is a dumb question, but how is fentanyl actually? Is it sold as a single substance, or is it almost always as a sort of a diluent within heroin or some other drug?
Yeah, so it's a good question because it really depends on what drug market specifically you're talking about. It's very regionalized in terms of what the opioid users in a specific market are specifically taking. It began as mostly a dilution drug, and for the reasons I mentioned before, it allows criminal organizations to sell way more of a higher potency, like way more of a diluted substance of higher potency. So that is how it kind of originally came into the U.S. market. And that's why you saw a lot of overdose, because there was people had no tolerance for these kind of new drugs that they didn't even know that were in the drugs that they were taking. So it began mostly as a dilution product. You've seen it evolved rapidly. There are entire cities and entire drug markets that are specifically and exclusively fentanyl. There are users that have grown accustomed to the high toxicity and need that level of potency in order to feel the same thing that they could have felt 5 years ago with a 50x less potent drug. So as the chemical kind of as there becomes like a community tolerance to fentanyl and to other opioids, it shifts from a dilution drug to a drug that's trafficked on its own merit. So yeah, of course.
Great presentation, Jordan.
Thanks,
Quick question. It's a little tangential, but I was wondering if you had noticed any shifts in Mexican authorities' policies that overlap with the shift from heroin to the synthetic drugs, and how the crackdown on drugs by Mexican authorities have accommodated that transition?
Yeah. So there has been recognition. There's been a reckoning, at least recently, in terms of I guess kind of given the United States renewed focus, or not renewed focus, but realization of the scope of the issue and the synthetic components of the opioid epidemic, any bilateral action that is occurring, just whether it be discussion, mostly discussion at this point, with Mexico and the United States on drug policy, has to do with synthetic opioids specifically. The answer to the second part of your question, what has been done specifically related to it, there's been a huge increase in raids on these clandestine laboratories. The data was unavailable for me I was originally intending to dig deep into the raids on clandestine laboratories and see what impacts that would have. But the data isn't there, but qualitative reporting says that there's been a complete shift from focus on aerial fumigation of crops and towards trying to bust clandestine laboratories in remote areas or cities as well. So there has been, at least I would say more so in rhetoric in terms of discussing with the United States, because they know that the synthetic opioids are impacting the United States on such a different level that any discussion has to revolve around it, and it has. But action, not so much, honestly.
Okay, we're into the short questions and short answers phase of the presentation. Ethan?
Thank you for the presentation.
And in fact, we're going to ask both questions, and then you'll do both answers at the same time. Make sure we get your questions in. Okay.
I'm really curious about the shipping of precursors to ports on Mexico's west coast. I guess, like, are there any shocks or things that you could see altering the current relationship or the current trends that we're seeing now, like looking at policy relevance or
Yeah,
projecting into
it's hard.
Hold,
It's
hold.
oh yeah, sorry.
That's the next question. Just to make sure we get everybody in on the queue.
I'm really curious about your foray into like network analysis, and
Yeah.
I'm curious about, you talk about data and the unavailability of data, and so I can appreciate the toil that you went through to try and do that. I'm curious what you think the benefit of doing that type of analysis would be in theory if you had the correct data, what that would look like, and how you think the best way to go about it or about collecting that would look like.
Yeah. Okay. Starting off with Ethan number one. So it's hard because you're trying to find a needle in a haystack when you're looking through huge shipping containers and trying to find it in the transit process. The way that the direction that most research and most law enforcement has been trending is going after the oftentimes legal pharmaceutical companies in China and big pharma manufacturing companies in China that are mass producing these synthetic opioids. There's been a change recently in 2018. China banned fentanyl and all of its analogs, which very much shifted the supply chain from China directly through mail to the U.S. to through Mexico itself. But there's been a reticence for the Chinese authorities to crack down on these legal, in many ways, kind of quasi-legal manufacturing setups, because why would they? They know that synthetic opioids and the epidemic is really impacting the United States politically and just the soul of the United States, and that's in a lot of their interests. They have no kind of motivation to crack down very hard on fentanyl coming out of China, except for kind of changing top line laws so they can point to the legal code and say we followed what you guys want on drug policy in the United States. Ethan number two, social network analysis. I'd say what I was trying to get at with social network analysis and why I think it's relevant to this thesis is that there's really no way to uncover the structure of these organizations unless you go through topics of social network analysis. So like a quick rundown is you would try to, via interviews or mostly via interviews and through criminal records, try to piece together a map of what the network of each cartel looks like. And from that, you could figure out kind of important bottom line things about that cartel. For example, like we looked over the ego nets of Sinaloa and CJNG. And the main difference that I was trying to investigate before I couldn't really find the data was that Sinaloa allows for the smaller organizations that they ally with to have separate alliances with each other, whereas CGNG is much more kind of centralized, where everyone is kind of under a direct affiliate. And so that kind of downstream from the structural setup, there are different tactics and strategies that each group uses based on their levels of centralization. So that's where I was going with that. I think it's really, really necessary in that you don't need, like, these organizations do not post their org charts online. Like you need some creative way to figure out what these organizations look like from the inside. And I think social network analysis, it's been shown useful in studying terrorist groups and studying other gangs in the United States. And it's useful in research studying organized crime in Mexico as well. So that's where I was going with that. But yeah, happy that I got here inside.
Great, thank you.